Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Perspectives from the Field Talk Show virtual edition. My name is Elizabeth Seary, and I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning at Foundations, Inc. We want to thank you for joining us today for a close-up on trauma-informed practice. Today, we have planned an interactive discussion about approaches to working with children exposed to traumatic events or conditions. I want to thank our fabulous host and White-Riley-Peterson Fellow, Shawn Petty. Shawn has been our Perspectives from the Field talk show host for the last 3 years at our Beyond School Hours conference. And we want to thank our special guest, Dr. Colleen Lelli, Director of the Center for Trauma and Domestic Violence Education at Cabrini University. Thanks for joining us today, Colleen.
Thank you.
We also want to have special thanks to the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their support. Without their support, this program wouldn't be possible. We want you to stay tuned for more perspectives from the field. Our next virtual event will be held Wednesday, September 12th. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shawn. Thanks again, Shawn, for joining us today.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me, and what an exciting day. Is it nice where you are, Colleen?
It is. It's actually, I'm in Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia. It's beautiful today. It's actually supposed to get up to 90 today.
90. Wow.
Yeah. We don't have a spring here.
Well, I am coming out of San Antonio, and I can tell you it is, we're sitting at about 80 degrees right now, which is unusual for us this time of year. It's nice wind, beautiful, sunny, and so just a great day to have a webinar and then get out and serve kids, right?
There you go.
Well, big kudos to Elizabeth, who is doing our tech behind the scenes, and for all the support staff at Foundations who are helping us with the Perspectives from the Field talk show, the live show, as well as these virtual shows. It's exciting. I see that Rhonda Lauer is on the webinar today. She's the head, the executive director of Foundations, so glad that she could join us, and just excited for this opportunity. And I'm very excited for our guest, Dr. Colleen Lelli. And may I call you Colleen during this webinar? Would that be acceptable?
Absolutely, please.
Thank you. Well, let's jump right in, because we only have about 1 hour to get through a massive topic, a great topic. Before I do jump in, though, I do want to share with everybody on the talk show today, we are leaving the chat room up and open, and that is your opportunity to ask questions. So please, as we're going through, that's kind of your back channel. It's an opportunity for you to throw out questions, and Elizabeth is going to make sure that we answer those questions. And if we don't answer them during our show, we'll try to answer them after, but she'll probably actually kind of poke us and make sure that we do it during the show to answer all your questions and try to make this as rigorous and interactive as possible. So, with that being said, tell me a little bit about yourself, Colleen. Where do you come from?
So I'm born and raised right outside of Philadelphia. I went through college at Cabrini, actually, so I'm an alum of Cabrini. I taught in the K-12 system, pre-K to 12, for about, I guess it was about, 8 years. And then from there, I went on to higher ed, and I taught at a couple community colleges. But while I was teaching at the high school level special education, I many times encountered a lot of students who were undergoing or who had gone through traumatic situations. So it really kind of tweaked my interest in a way. And then while at the university, I was asked to attend a meeting. And at that meeting, they were talking about ways that we can train educators better about domestic violence education and children of trauma.
Okay.
So that's really how it started. And then through my doctoral work, I really got into it. My background is predominantly in reading. So I use a lot of ways, a lot of strategies with reading to talk to children about trauma and to help them.
So, wow. I mean, well, there was a lot packed into that A short 3 minutes. So you teach at the same university you went to, and that's really cool. You must really love the university.
I do. I do. It's a great place to be. It's a great place to be.
That's awesome, and what a great opportunity, to teach in the K through 12 environment, and then to come and teach in the college environment, in such an interesting field. So let me ask you just a general question and I'm playing devil's advocate, and that is, why is trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care important? Like, why should we care?
Hopefully that's better. I think that it's really important because many times there are children that are affected by trauma and we're not even aware of it.
Okay.
And so I think that it's something that we need to know. And many times there's a lot of misdiagnosis, and they're diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, behavioral issues. And so many times they're misdiagnosed, but there's other things that we can still do, strategies in the classroom, outside the classroom when we're working with children to help them get through that trauma, and then after the trauma as well.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions about the misdiagnosis. So, is trauma, and I know we're going to delve into what exactly trauma is, but a lot of times I hear people say it's high risk behavior, or sometimes I hear people say it's a health issue. So, what is it? Is it a high risk behavior, or is it a health issue?
Sure. Well, when I explain it to everyone, I tell everyone it's an everybody issue, if that makes sense. So, yes, it could be a health issue. Yes, it could be a behavioral issue, but everyone needs to be concerned. So, it's a community driven response that needs to happen. And so, I think that that's a piece that's been missing. We've done a lot of research in different pockets, but no one's talking to one another. And so, I'm starting to see in the research, we're starting to talk more to each other in different fields. And I think that's what's really needed.
Okay, I like what you really said there. It's an everybody issue. It's not just one
Yeah.
thing or another. And I like how you really address it, with the community, because like you said, I've heard all kinds of things when we talk about childhood trauma, and a lot of things I hear are, well, it's a health issue, it's got to be dealt with a health specialist, or, let's medicate the child. I hear that sometimes. So if we start digging down, and this will kind of take us to our next slide, so to speak, but I think it starts perhaps with, I've heard it starts with stress. Is that true?
So, yeah, and if we look at the slide here, you'll see there are different levelings of stress. So, and we actually want mild or positive stress and or tolerable or moderate. We actually want those. That's actually a lot of times normal.
So
It's essential for part of healthy.
having stress
Yeah.
is normal?
Yes. So we want stress because it's teaching us how to deal with stress. So it's really important when we're delaying children. For example, mom and dad get home from work, let's play, and well, wait a minute. You need to wait a minute. We need to get X, Y, Z done first, and then we can do that. And so that's or even pregame jitters, right? So a lot of times we get pregame jitters before a game or before a big
Sure.
event. My daughter's a dancer, so before she dances, I can always tell she's very quiet and reserved and not bubbly like she normally is, and I can tell she's stressed. That's normal. We want that because we want them to learn how to push through that and how to persevere and how to have determination and grit. And so I think those are some of the things that is important and we need to have. And then we move into tolerable or moderate stress. And that's okay too, but that's a little bit longer lasting.
Okay.
It's a little bit more severe. So loss of a loved one might fall into this area. A quote unquote natural disaster, right? So it's still prolonged, but and I'm not recommending that we want to see this all the time, but this is something that children do have to, in fact, be given strategies to push through. And it's when we get into the toxic or chronic stress that can then lead to trauma. And so that's something that we really need to look a little bit more closer at. And that those are the areas that we really want to concentrate on, because they're the areas that can, in fact, have long lasting, intensive type reactions.
Okay.
So if you take a look at the next slide, for instance, yeah, so, this toxic or chronic stress can be long lasting and intensive and can disrupt the development of brain structure or brain architecture, as it's
Okay.
called. And we'll talk a little bit about the brain today, but there's tons of research that's now being done in terms of um, what stress does to a brain. And so there's a prolonged sense of fear. There can be cognitive impairments, which is what we can see in the classroom. That's what we can see right outside the classroom. So before or after care, we will see that.
Okay.
So it's really important. And when you look at the stress response system and the way that there are different hormones that affect the brain, and those hormones is in fact what is impairing the brain, if you
So you
will.
actually sent me a picture of the brain, and
Yep.
I had this long-term dream of being a neuroscientist, so it fascinated.
Me too.
So it fascinated me. Let me bring it up, and maybe you can explain what's going on, because I think, it's kind of funny in the after-school environment, which is what a lot of our listeners
Yep.
participate in.
Sure.
We get the kids, literally when they've been through school all day long. And
I know.
sometimes their behavior can be very interesting. It can be really good, or it can be off the chart, or it can almost be depressive, you know. And I think it
Yep.
might be a result of some of the things you're talking about. So let me bring this up and you can kind of explain what exactly is happening to our brain.
Sure.
Um, I'll make it
Sure.
bigger.
So you see the stress response system, and basically your pituitary glands and your adrenal glands, when you're in the fight or flight, your adrenal gland is pushing out those hormones. And so you can see the cortisol is what's going, and then there's also the hormones, and I won't get too technical, but CRH and ACTH, there are the other hormones that are at play here. They're coming out of your pituitary gland and your
Okay.
hypothalamus. And so what's happening is they're going to your immune system, and that extra shot of adrenaline when you're in the fight or flight is what's helping you to get through that situation. Children of trauma, unfortunately, their adrenal gland is working overtime. Okay, it's pushing out those hormones constantly.
Okay.
And so that is what's happening as a child and is going through this trauma. This hormone is constantly going. And so what you're seeing, and you talk about, sometimes you have behaviors that are external, and then sometimes you'll have internal behaviors. So those behaviors, that's the problem with trauma. You don't know exactly how a child's going to react. They can all act differently. So you might have a child who is internalizing those behaviors, but then you might have children that are externalizing. And so that's what makes it difficult. And so that's why it's really important, we'll see later, that you have a variety of strategies to choose from when you're trying to work with children, whether it be in the classroom or before or after care.
Okay. So so when does on the slide here you say that it produces behaviors that are like hypervigilance. Um,
Yeah,
Share a little bit more about that. What does that look like for us?
exactly. So that's kind of that adrenal gland. And so we're going to talk in a few minutes. There's a doctor, Dr. Nadine Burke Harris, and she talks a lot about the bear. Like when you see a bear, your heart starts racing. The adrenal gland is producing that
Okay.
hormone. That's that hypervigilance too. So many times a child, and I give this example just because a lot of my background has been working with children of domestic violence. So many times children in a domestic violence situation, they're witnessing violence on a regular basis, literally war in their home.
Okay.
So their hypervigilance for them is to be safe all the time. So they're constantly thinking about being safe. And so that hypervigilance is the priority for them. Similarly, a child might have violence in their neighborhood. And so they've been taught to listen distinctly for certain noises. So if they hear a car backfiring, they're going to jump and they're going to try and hide. Same thing with a child, maybe who, when you look at safety and hypervigilance, they're trying to be safe. Homelessness is another example. So their hypervigilance is again just living and making sure that they have what they need to survive. So that's where that hypervigilance comes in, and it's producing these behaviors that are associated with that hypervigilance.
So
does that make
it
sense?
does. So when does this translate into trauma?
Mm-hmm. So if we take a look at the next slide, so then what is trauma, right? So it's an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury. And I'm reading from the slide, and then I'll explain, to the child or others, or a threat to the psychological or physical integrity of the child or others. And then another example would be, it's an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. So many times what we will see is with trauma, we will see a lot of times, let me back up. So trauma could be a single event. And so a child could be traumatized. And basically it's trauma is not something that we label, believe it or not, but it's something that takes up a situation. So in other words, a child is not traumatized by a single situation, or they could be traumatized by a single situation. So trauma is really in the eye of the beholder sometimes.
Okay.
So trauma will affect every individual differently. And so you're not going to see the same reaction. You're not going to see the same road of recovery, if you will. So an example I give, and my husband would probably not be happy that I give this example often, but I do. My husband, when he was 3, almost drowned in a swimming pool, and one of his siblings saved him. And so as a result of that, he's tried to learn to swim, but he can't. He doesn't know how to swim. He told me one time, he said, it feels like I am suffocating underwater. It feels like I'm going to suffocate. So for him, that was a very traumatic situation. But that situation has happened to other people too, but then they've learned to swim. So it really depends on the person. So that's why we can't really say to one person, you shouldn't feel that way, or, well, this person doesn't feel that way, how come you do? So you really have to look at each person's situation and how they're taking that situation individually.
So
an interesting tidbit too. Yeah.
Well, wow. I mean, that's very hard to diagnose then, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so interestingly, when we look at PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in the DSM-3, which is basically a psychologist and a psychiatrist Bible, right? That's what they use for diagnosis. In that third version, they focus very narrowly on catastrophic events in terms of trauma. So they looked at war, rape, natural disasters. But since then, we've updated it, and now we're on the DSM-5. And now, in 2013, the definition has been expanded, and that includes ordinary stressors that we would include, like divorce, poverty, serious illness, and so forth. So as the term trauma has become more mainstreamed, the definition has become broader, and it varies across fields. And so interestingly, I was talking to a guidance counselor recently, and she said, I kept using the term trauma, and she said, can you please explain to me what you mean about trauma? What is it? And so I explained to her that it's very broad. And so what she learned was technically the DSM-3. And then I explained to her that it's been broadened now. And she goes, oh, I understand. The conversation started because she said, well, we don't have any children of trauma. And I said, well, that's great. But then as I expanded and I started talking about divorce and serious illness and poverty, then she said, okay, can we talk a little bit more about what that definition looks like and unpack that? And so once we did, she said, you're right, and we do have children of trauma in our school. So it's very broad now. And because they have little control over their physical or emotional response to the event, we will see that many times if they're experiencing trauma, it can be significant, it can be negative, and so there can be a greater impact the younger the child is, too.
So interesting. So, wow, I'm trying to wrap my head around just because in the after school environment, particularly, we work with at-risk youth. We work in socioeconomic, dangerous situations almost.
Yeah.
And I think this new definition of trauma, so to speak, or the expanded version of trauma, will really open up our eyes to dealing with children that in the past might be like, oh, we need a behavior intervention or we need this. But it almost sounds like it's
Right.
behavior and health wrapped up in one.
Yeah, and so interestingly, one of my goals, not there yet, but one of my goals is to work and to figure out how we can better inform teachers and administrators and staff and anyone working with children, especially when they have an IEP plan. You know, how can we better have specially designed instruction for children of trauma? So what does that look like? Or in 504 plans, you know, what does that look like? And so that's something that I think would help and benefit everybody because we would have a better understanding.
And just for anybody in our audience who might not know what a 504 or an IEP is, what exactly are those?
Yep. So an IEP is given to children with special needs. There's 13 categories. Trauma is not one of those categories. That no, trauma's not. Trauma could classify though as other health impairments, and that would then qualify for a 504. So a 504 is usually health related. Okay. So a 504 could be cystic fibrosis. It could be a child who has cancer. I would think trauma would classify. It has not been brought up quite yet in terms of discussing that further, but that's something that I think we have to have conversations. And ADD and ADHD, believe it or not, is a medical diagnosis. So therefore, a lot of times children will have 504 plans. Now, what happens with ADD and ADHD is it's comorbid a lot of times, which means they have other disabilities as well, which then would qualify for an IEP. So many times they might have ADD, ADHD, and a reading disability. And so then therefore they would have an IEP because learning disabilities is one of the 13 categories.
Huh.
Yeah, so there's 504 plans and there's IEPs. And they're two plans that I think that if we had better knowledge of trauma and that was better impacted within those two plans, we would have a better understanding of how to help our students.
Well, it's interesting. Thank you for clarifying those two tools as well, those two items, because I think in the after school field, a lot of times we're not privy to some of that. And
that's unfortunate too. And I think that that's something that should change.
I agree. I mean, wholeheartedly, because, we're taking care of students that are coming to us and we may not have the entire picture. So we're making assumptions based on our observation of behavior or situation. But I know when you and I were talking, and this is a question that's actually been asked in the chat room, you were sharing that trauma or having this high level of stress does all kinds of things to our brain. And one of the questions we have are there specific, I'm going to read it verbatim, are there specific things that happen to the body when cortisol and the other two hormones are released on a constant basis, which is kind of, in this environment? And I think you talked about it on the next slide.
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. So I talk about it a little bit, and I talk about how trauma is toxic, and there's that flight, fight, or freeze or response that our body, and basically what happens is toxic stress and or trauma can damage the architecture of the developing brain, leading to disruptive circuits and a weakened foundation or future learning and health. So basically, our body is designed to remain in this state of alert for only a brief time. But what happens is when we're exposed to something like complex trauma or trauma, the brain shifts its operation, as I was explaining earlier. So basically what we will see is because the brain is so sensitive and those elevated levels of those stress hormones, there's the adrenal, the cortisol, the norepinephrine, they can disrupt the development of the brain. And that can affect, so here we go, it can affect the learning. It can affect moods. It can affect relational skills, or how to be within a relationship, with whether it's a friendship or relationship. It can impact that. And also it can impact aspects of executive functioning. Executive functioning is really what we need for everything, especially when it comes to learning. So if executive functioning is impacted, then they're going to have difficulty for sure learning. And so in the following slides, I will talk about, it's not all forgotten though. It's not something that we can just say, oh, well, and throw up our hands and go, we can't do anything. There are things we can definitely do, and we can definitely support the student. But I do first want to talk a little bit about the ACE study, if that's okay. And then I think following that, we can talk about some strategies.
Well, and along with the ACE study, because I know you're going to delve into that, I also want you to talk about too, because there's an aspect that we're talking about youth here, but there's also an aspect about our own selves and our own health that we're talking about. I was thinking, you know, working in various environments, sometimes we're in that flight, fight, or freeze response all the time as well. So there's a health aspect there. So as you talk about the ACE study and further, could you also highlight a little bit about that too?
Yes, for sure. And that fits very nicely, because there's, if you're not aware, there's a study. It's an adverse childhood experience study. And basically, in the late 1990s, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti, I had a look to make sure I got their names right, they had a collaborative project between CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the Department of Preventive Medicine at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. And basically, they explored the relationship, and this is where the health piece comes in, between children's emotional experiences and their subsequent mental and physical health as adults. So what they did was they had a questionnaire, and this questionnaire, as adults, they filled this out, and basically they had these adverse experiences. And you can see they're listed here. They looked at abuse, and they asked questions like, were you abused physically, emotionally, sexually? Did you witness any type of emotional or physical neglect, or were you neglected yourself? Did you see your mother treated violently? So that's witnessing the violence. Is there mental illness? Do you have incarcerated relatives? Has there been substance abuse in your family, or divorce? So they looked at these and asked these questions, and what they found, and it was a huge study. So there was the demographics were very interesting. A lot of people were involved in this study. Basically, these items here are called ACEs, and they found that the more ACEs a person has, the more that they will have greater health risks later in life. Heart attacks, high blood pressure, heart disease. So they found that these ACEs contributed closely to these adverse childhood experiences. So as a result of that, there have been lots of studies that have happened. And one of the people that has worked directly with children then, and took the questionnaire and gave it to children. And again, this is in the health field, and this is what I was saying. I think that we need the health field as well as the education. Everyone needs to be working together. It's like an everybody issue. Nadine Burke-Harris, who is this phenomenal woman and who is going to be at GLR Week in July, and you'll hear more about that at the end. She actually just wrote this book. I'll hold it up so that you can see. It's called The Deepest Well, and it's by Nadine Burke-Harris. She wrote it in 2018. It just came out. But she goes into great detail about the brain and the hormones and how they affect. So she talks all about that. She talks about how the children react and their well-being and how that's affected, as well as their mental and their physical state. She talks a lot about what we need to do to support our children who have been in these who have had these adverse childhood experiences, or these ACEs.
So she calls the book The Deepest Well because of a reason, right?
Yeah, The Deepest Well. So in her TED Talk, and there is a link for that will be you'll be able to get to later, all the participants here. But she said, as a doctor, we can keep giving kids dose after dose, and that's exactly which dose after dose of antibiotic when they have a stomach virus, right? We can keep going. Or we can say, well, wait a minute, they're all drinking out of the same well. What the hell is in this well? So she talks a lot about policy, like what, and so I'm thinking that's what the reference is. I'm almost, yes, I'm towards the very end of the book. So I'm hoping she'll get that reference soon. But and that's exactly it. It's about policy, and it's about, like, we can say, well, we have another kid here who's showing these same symptoms, and oh, here's another high school dropout, but why are they dropping out? And that was another study that was done, by the way. They found that a lot of kids that dropped out of school were a result of they had a lot of ACEs. Their ACE score was very high. So if we can get to that, that's where we can solve some of these
So
problems.
with these ACEs, I think it's really interesting because you mentioned, it's not only the fact whether you've been yourself through physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, or abuse in general, but it's also the observation of such items that affects you as well. So, if you're a youth growing up, as a child, if you grew up in a very, challenged environment where you might not have had these things happen, but you see it happening to people all around you, then your ACEs score would be higher when you're an adult, which could lead to, not only behavioral societal problems, but also health-related problems.
Yeah. And it's very interesting because a lot of us have high ACE scores. And so it's a matter of, well, how, it's sometimes it's just a matter of who was there for us to support us through that stress and to teach us ways to be determined and to have that grit and perseverance that we hear so much about. And so I think many times what we need to know is it's the relationships that can really, really help support us and help support these children.
So that's perfect tie into this slide right here. Share a little bit more about that, because I think we're starting to go into there's the problem, there's the issue that we need to diagnose. Now, what's the solution?
And interestingly, Dr. Harris talks about this in her book as well. She says that and I was watching it's called Paper Clips. It's a great video documentary following some students who have been through trauma. But they had people, right? They had teachers, they had people, coaches, after school, before school care folks. They had people and supportive relationships that help buffer, protect these young children from the effects of trauma and or toxic stress. So it's those people, and many times we think back and we know that we've had teachers that were not so great, but then there's other teachers that were like, oh my goodness, yes, that teacher did it for me. I have a student right now teaching at the university. She was just given an award, a scholarship award, and so she has a luncheon on Thursday. Well, here, the award that she's getting is through this retired teachers organization. One of the teachers, she saw that I nominated this student, and she was my teacher. And so I'll get to see her on Thursday, and she's one of probably the top, I say top 10. I have top 10 because I had lots of good teachers. I was very fortunate, but I had a lot of top 10 folks that really supported me. So really, that's what it's about. And Dr. Harris talked about it in this documentary. They talk about it. It's those relationships that really help, even when they're living in situations that are not what we would not classify as well or good at all. We can still support them and get them through that.
So the supportive relationship, you've highlighted and shared a couple of amazing examples, but in this next area, you start talking about language.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit more about how, and so I think somebody asked earlier, how are you affected? Physically you're affected. I just saw someone ask about, yes, paper clips. I think that's the name of it. I can look it up later, but I think that's the name of it. Or paper, it's paper something, but it's about children of trauma. Yeah. So, so expressive and receptive language can be impacted the most. So what happens when you have traumatic situations, both receptive and expressive language can definitely be impacted. So expressive is our speaking and writing, and receptive is our listening and our reading. So after school folks, if you're working on homework and you're like wondering why is a child having difficulty in these areas, it could be in fact trauma. Or maybe you do know that it's trauma. Maybe you know that the child's mom is suffering from cancer, right? So their language could be. And so researchers found a significant correlation between child neglect as well as traumatic situations in both receptive and expressive language, the stress, and also limited conversational skills at home can also impact the receptive and expressive language piece. They're going to need activities where spoken language is scaffolded. So many times you're going to have to ask questions, maybe while they're completing homework, while they're trying to get long-term projects done. You're going to have to scaffold, make sure that they understand the planning of that. Providing activities to build vocabulary is very helpful. Developing sequential skills. So you'll see in the next slide when we get there in a second that memory is impacted, and so that can impact sequential skills. So many times I'll say to teachers, I'll say, and administrators, do you want to improve your test scores? And they're all like,
right.
Yes, of course, we want great test scores. And I'm like, well, then you got to look at these. These are the things that you need to look at. You need to look at expressive and receptive language, and how can you support those for children of trauma. And here's the thing. I come from a background of special ed. There's something called Universal Design for Learning, UDL, which basically is if you use the strategies you use for students with learning difficulties, if you use them from everybody, then it's universal. It's kind of like our sidewalks, right? When the ADA law came out and said everybody has to have the sidewalk ramps, and they went around and made sidewalk ramps, right? Well, now they're universal for everybody. Runners can now use them. Moms with strollers are using them. That's the whole design idea behind universal design. So it's really important that we look and we think about just using these strategies for everybody. And then hopefully we're touching on those kids of trauma, even if we don't know if they're traumatized.
I love that tactic. So it's let's take this into account as we design our programs, as we design our educational systems. Let's make it universal.
Why not? Yeah. Right, because then we're touching everybody. Like, a graphic organizer. So a graphic organizer is like a story map, or you might have a circle in the middle of a page and it has the story, and then you have a line and another circle and you tell the setting, and then another line. That's a graphic organizer. So if it says that if you know that a child does well with a graphic organizer, just use them for everybody, and then you've got it covered. So it's very similar to that.
Have you seen
memory? And so if you look at the next slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. All right. So memory.
No, go ahead. Ask your question.
Well, I was on this last slide. I was just, do you have any examples of expressive versus receptive, and what you've seen, and what for our participants on the webinar today or on the show today, so that we can go back and kind of just have our eyes open to it if we're not aware.
Sure. So expressive language. So expressing. So speaking and writing. So speaking. So a lot of times they're going to have difficulty with problem solving, for instance. So they're not going to be able to provide. So if I said, well, what happened last night? They may have difficulty with explaining what happened last night. So a lot of times you're going to have to scaffold. So, or it might be disjointed, and you'll have to do like you're doing for me. You're going to have to ask questions. So asking questions is a great way to scaffold when they're speaking. Writing. Using graphic organizers is very helpful, because in writing, they have to start from a beginning, a middle, and an end. So providing them graphic organizers, like what are you going to talk about first? What are you going to talk about next? What are you going to talk about last? Providing those scaffolds will help them with their writing process.
So this goes beyond the student who's like, you're like, okay, so why didn't you do your homework? I don't know, I just didn't. It's right. digging yep. a little further. Open-ended questions, I'm assuming?
Yeah, so, did something happen last night? Or, did you just not do it because you didn't want to and you felt like you were too busy? I mean, you can even feed them, but trying to get out of them, to express expressing feelings is very difficult for children of trauma because they're so busy being hypervigilant and protecting themselves that they can't really talk about how they feel. So that's another big issue too.
Right. I know as a individual who sometimes looks like I do in the classrooms that I'm working with, sometimes there's also a barrier, folks are like, "Oh, you're a guy," or "Oh, I don't want to talk to you." So
Yeah.
so
Right. And again, finding that person, it doesn't have to be everyone. I know there's been times for me where I've had, students who just, they didn't want to talk to me. So I try to find someone that I know that they would
yeah.
connect with.
So what's the opposite coin, the receptive?
So then the receptive is listening and reading. And so listening again, they're going to have difficulty hearing and listening. And so many times you might be looking and it looks like they're paying attention. And you'll say, "Did you hear me? Did you hear what I said?" So a lot of times it's okay repeating the directions back. So they either repeat it back to you or they turn and talk and again, if you do this universally for everybody turn and talk. What were the directions? And then everyone turns and talks, make sure they get it. Okay, now go, whatever it is they're doing. And so that piece is very helpful. Reading, again, they're going to need lots of questioning, lots of pausing. Not so much pausing that it's disrupting comprehension, but enough to make sure that they are in fact comprehending. Because the comprehension, when we talked about how the brain's impacted, those areas of the brain, you have your executive functioning. We have areas in the brain called Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They're the two areas for language, and they're the two areas that are impacted, expressive and receptive language.
Interesting. So now I know you were going to take it into memory, and so what's that connection?
So trauma obviously is going to affect memory, and it's going to affect their capacity. So basically, children's working memory is going to be extensively reduced. Okay, and so working memory, when we think about working memory, that is the memory that they're working on at the moment. It's like everything's coming in and being churned in that working memory area. And so they're not able to remember events. They're not able to sometimes sequence. So they're going to have working memory problems. And so it's really important for us to be able to build on what it is they know, sometimes starting backwards. So if they had to read something and starting backwards, like what happened last instead of what happened first, that's helpful. The child that didn't do their homework, well, tell me about this morning when you woke up. Starting there and working backwards sometimes.
Is there any danger in doing that? I'm just curious because I know a lot of folks who have dealt with trauma. Sometimes the memory function, as you start to help them, it leads into something different. So, like, is there anything we need to be careful of?
So you might, and it's hard for you to know if a child's been traumatized or if they haven't. So that's why all this training is very important. And we're not meant to be counselors a lot of times, although we feel like we are. So it's really important for us to recognize the strategies we can use. And the questioning is okay, but you want to make sure that instead, what I suggest is if you think working memory is impacted, then let's get to the strategies that you can use. And so some of the strategies that we'll get to, sometimes it's the strategy use instead that's more helpful. Because again, we're not counselors, we're not meant to be counselors. But also knowing so when I talked about it being an everybody issue, in a perfect world, I would love for schools and after school and before school programs, everyone to be connected. And one of the pieces that we would be connected to is community service, community agencies that provide services. So for instance, I'm a member on the board of a place called Laurel House, and Laurel House is a comprehensive domestic violence agency, but they do training in the field. And so, that would be a great place to get information about dating violence, domestic violence, children who witness, and how it's impacted them. So if you feel that you have a child that's impacted, or if that's even better. If but now they're in school because now they're in the shelter, what strategies can I use for that child? And then you would be able to go to that community agency and they can say, here's your strategy instruction.
Interesting. And I know we're about to delve into some of those strategies, and as we do that, can you make the connection to like social emotional learning as a hot topic right now in the after school field? Um, and a lot of times I don't know if we truly, it's just like trauma. Do we truly understand it? It's kind of, it started as as a certain definition. It's been expanded. Could you tie in, as we're talking about strategies as well, link it to the SEL focus that seems to be, sweeping through our field right now?
Yes, sure. And one of the things with the SEL approach that is very important to remember is, again, just that piece of being mindful of students and children, and having an understanding of that when they go home, it's not
Sure.
all perfect, and also having an understanding of those relationships and how important those relationships are. So, let's go to the strategy instruction. Yeah, let's do
Okay.
that. And so, when we look at connecting with text, so they're reading something, so they're doing their homework after school, and they have to have this, they're going to have a lot of times difficulty connecting to the characters or the storyline, because a lot of times the books we use in school are in fact very happy. And so we want them to connect to the characters, but in connecting to the characters, they either don't look like them, or they're not suffering from the same experiences that they are. So they're going to have a really tough time trying to connect. So that's why quality children's literature should be used. And a little bit later, we'll talk about some of the literature that can be used. However, with the understanding that the literature I'm presenting has the characters have had significant trauma. And so it's really something that you don't want to read to everybody. It's something that maybe a counselor can use, or you can use in a one-on-one session if you're given permission. And so those are some of the things that we'll talk about in a few moments. Asking questions, we kind of already talked about, making sure they're staying focused with what they're reading, setting goals. Traumatized children act a lot of times instead of plan. And so task analysis, that's something we use in the field of special ed. It's taking a task and breaking it down into its parts. That will sometimes help with the act of reading. So depending on if it's a content area book like social studies or science, so let's say that they have to read a section in social studies. Step one, look at the headings. Step two, look at the questions at the end of the section. Something that seems so easy to us and that we've been trained to do. Many times students need that extra prompting to remember to do that.
So
those are just some strategy instruction pieces that you can.
So you're saying that traumatized children just will jump right in and act upon it, like even when they're reading?
Sometimes, yeah,
Huh.
yeah. So sometimes when they're reading, they'll just read to read, and they're not thinking through that process of let me stop and reflect and question myself as a reader. There's a strategy that's out there. It's called QAR.
Okay.
Question answer relationship.
QAR.
And so the QAR strategy, yep, QAR is a great way. There's lots of stuff on the internet, and that's something that I'd be happy to send more on later. But that's a great strategy, a specific strategy that you can use too to help them question what they're reading. So it looks at, here's the question that I'm being asked after reading. Is that question directly in the text? Is it something that I have to have in the text and my head, so it's text ahead? Or is it something in the outside world that I have to bring in my background knowledge? So that's a great strategy to teach them and to implement if they're not already using it.
And that actually helps children who have had trauma?
Yeah, it has shown that it helps them in terms of, it helps them to think about their reading. And so many times when they're reading, they're not thinking about their reading. Yeah. And so some of the other strategies I think that we see here are telling students to focus on the directions you're about to give. I think I talked about that already. And then having them summarize those directions. Visual task cards, that shows each step in a task. So sometimes we use those for our students with autism. But they can be helpful for again, when we talk about universal design, it can be used for anybody. Children of trauma can also help because, again, it's that sequencing that they're having difficulty with, that the visual task cards keep them on task.
My wife
So
uses
before,
that with me at the grocery store. Like,
exactly. Exactly. Here's a picture of what you need. Yes. But it truly does help. The visual helps. Some of us are visual learners. Some of us are auditory learners. So those visual task cards can really help everybody.
so
And then also having children work together is another very
as well
helpful
said, that
tip.
last one there, do you find that children who have uh, had a lot of traumatic events or are living in constant trauma, do you find that they have a tough time working in groups?
They can. I think that yes, they can. It depends on the external behaviors that they're showing or the internal behaviors that they're showing, exhibiting. So I think what's really important is maybe talking the child ahead of time and saying, hey, I'm going to put you in this group and this is what I'm expecting from you. And then having a group discussion, not calling out the kid, but saying, here's your roles, each of you in this group, and this is what I'm expecting. And so everyone knows what the
Mm.
expectations are. So I think that that's helpful. What's the hardest thing is, I'm talking perfect world scenarios, right? So sometimes I have found when I've done professional developments that what the person's telling me is great in a perfect world, but I also have found that sometimes I can take certain strategies and tweak them to work for me. So that's also the goal here too. Like some of these strategies might not work in your setting, but then there might be ones that you could implement and just tweak a
I'm
bit.
I'm so
So
glad you brought that up
yeah,
because a lot of times I do training nationwide, and we always train to the perfect, so that people can take it away and tweak it to their situations. So I appreciate you bringing
yes,
that up.
exactly. Yeah, for sure. And these are just some other strategies. Encourage children to use the graphic organizers, like I've talked about. Also, providing children with verbal prompts to solve problems and resolve conflicts with peers. So, teaching them how to solve problems is very helpful. That modeling. Sometimes there's things called social stories that you can find online, and it shows children working out problems. That's very helpful. There's peer mediated research out there talking about peer mediated groups. It's helpful. Timelines is very helpful for teaching students to sequence events. So that's very helpful. The sequencing of those events and what they're reading is very
I
helpful.
find this so interesting. Provide children with verbal prompts, solve problems, and resolve conflicts with peers. And then you shared that there are examples of this. If we turn on the news today, it's all about conflict. It's all about how we're trying to get our own way,
Yeah,
you know?
I
And so
know.
it's
I
interesting that a
know.
strategy to help
Yeah.
trauma is, showing how we come to compromises and resolutions versus I have to win. Um,
That's right. And the social stories are used a lot of times for children of children
yeah,
of trauma. So, excuse me, children with autism as well. So social stories are being used in a variety of settings.
interesting. Well, we are. This has just been full of information, and so we're at about 6 minutes. Um,
Oh, so how about I show the children's
yeah,
list, and then I can. If there's any other further questions. So what's really cool about
I'm
this
gonna bring
list
up
here,
the
and
graphics kind of changed for some reason, so I'm gonna bring up another picture. There we go.
there we go. That one works. So, if you take a look, a couple of these books would not be helpful to read, as I stated, in a full group setting. Like, hey, today we're going to talk about a terrible thing happened. That book is more for a one on one. But there are some books here. Have You Filled a Bucket Today is a
Yeah.
great book. And it's all about, uplifting and filling people's buckets rather than dumping them. So that's, again, something we can all learn today. Spaghetti in a Hot Dog Bun is great too. So that's another book that talks about a young girl who's being bullied or I don't know, like teased. I guess it's bullying, because because of her hair and because she eats spaghetti in a hot dog bun. And then the other book that's a really great one is When Sophie Gets Angry, Really, Really Angry. Again, some children of trauma are going to have difficulty externalizing their feelings. So books like that, and then there's another great book Jamie Lee Curtis wrote. How I Feel Today, I
I
think
love
it's
that book.
called. That's another great book. Yeah, that's another great book that helps with feelings. So I did provide two book lists, one for children of trauma and one to teach resilience. And so the Elementary school, that's a great question. I think one of the books has all levels, but the other one might be more geared towards the pre-K 6. So those book lists, yes, and we'll make sure they're available if they're not able to be retrieved right now. We can certainly do that. That's not a problem.
Okay, and one of the questions that we have is, so it looks a little bit like it might be for like elementary age students. Do you have any resources for maybe middle school?
Yeah, let me check because again, I've done so much research over the past 10 years, I guess it's been. I know I have a list somewhere floating around that has some middle school. So if I can just send that to Elizabeth and then she can post it maybe, or to you, that would be,
Yeah,
that
either
would
one.
work. Okay.
And so perfect. We have Elizabeth actually for some uncanny reason got kicked off. So I have this little timer that
Okay.
says we have 3 minutes. So I guess we have to
Okay.
wrap up in 3 minutes. But with that being said, let me gear it towards kind of your final thoughts. So you have a video that you usually show when you're wrapping up.
Yes. So this video just kind of reiterates everything I just went over. So it's about 2 minutes long. So if we have
Yeah.
time to show it, we can certainly show it now. It's a brief video. It provides, I think, 5 strategies for what you can do for children of trauma and to support them either in the classroom. It's specifically geared to teachers, but please don't be offended. I think all the strategies work for before and after care. And I keep saying teachers because I view you all as teachers anyway. So I think this goes for anyone working with children.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video for everybody. If for some uncanny reason we lose our connection or everything, we will reach out to everybody. So I apologize about that. There must be some tech issues going on. But we'll play this and we'll see how we go. All right, here we are.
Okay.